Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In the vibrant Castro district of 1970s San Francisco, a killer turned the art of portraiture into a deadly weapon. Known as the Doodler, this predator would sketch his victims at local gay bars before leading them to their deaths. With at least 5 confirmed murders, multiple survivors, and a prime suspect who was never charged, this case exposes how societal prejudice helped a killer escape justice. Tonight, we'll explore the dark story of the man who turned his sketchbook into a hit list. Let's begin. In the mid-1970s, San Francisco's Castro district was emerging as a vibrant hub of LGBTQ+ life, a place where gay men could finally find community and acceptance in an era still marked by widespread discrimination. But beneath the surface of this cultural renaissance, a predator was stalking the neighborhood's dimly lit bars and clubs, turning what should have been safe spaces into hunting grounds. Between January 1974 and September 1975, a series of brutal murders sent shockwaves through San Francisco's gay community. The killer would become known as the Doodler, named for his distinctive method of approaching victims. He would sit at bars, sketching portraits of men he found attractive, using his artistic talent as a disarming way to initiate conversation. The first known victim was discovered on January 27, 1974, along the ocean near Land's End. Gerald Kavanaugh, a 49-year-old Canadian-American immigrant, was found face up on the beach, his body bearing multiple stab wounds. The medical examiner would later determine that Kavanaugh had fought desperately for his life, with defensive wounds on his hands and arms indicating a violent struggle. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a calculated close-range attack. Detective Tom Kavanaugh, one of the original investigators, noted something peculiar about the crime scene. The victim's clothes were relatively undisturbed, and there were no signs of robbery. This suggested that the killer's motivation wasn't theft, but something far more sinister. The location of the body, in an area known for clandestine meetings between gay men, would later prove significant as a pattern emerged. Just 2 weeks later, on February 7, 1974, the body of Joseph J. Stevens was discovered at Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park. Stevens, a 27-year-old popular drag performer and comedian, had been stabbed multiple times and left to die. Like Kavanaugh, Stevens had last been seen alive in a Castro district gay bar. Witnesses would later recall seeing him talking to a tall, young black man who had been drawing sketches. The killer's pattern began to take shape with the discovery of Klaus Christmann on July 7, 1974. Christmann, a 31-year-old German immigrant, was found near Ocean Beach, again with multiple stab wounds. What made this case particularly notable was that Christmann was married with children, living what investigators called a double life. This detail would later prove crucial in understanding why some survivors of the Doodler's attacks were hesitant to come forward. The fourth known victim, Frederick Capin, was discovered on May 12, 1975. Capin was a 32-year-old nurse, and like the others, his body was found near Ocean Beach. The similarities in the crime scenes were unmistakable. The same frenzied stabbing pattern, the same type of location, the same connection to the Castro district's gay nightlife. The final confirmed victim was Harold Gullberg, a 66-year-old Swedish sailor, whose decomposing body was found on June 4, 1975, near Lincoln Park. By this point, the gay community was in a state of terror, and the police were facing mounting pressure to catch the killer. What made the Doodler case particularly frustrating for investigators was that there were survivors. At least 3 men had escaped attacks by the same suspect. These survivors provided consistent descriptions. The killer was a young black man, between 19 and 25 years old, around 6 feet tall, lanky but athletic, with a medium complexion and smooth skin. He was well educated, spoke softly, and was an ambitious artist who talked about wanting to pursue a career in animation. One survivor described meeting the suspect at the Fox Plaza bar. The man had sat down next to him and begun sketching his portrait, striking up a conversation about art and his aspirations. They left together, but when they reached a more secluded area, the suspect's demeanor changed dramatically. The survivor managed to fight him off and escape, but like the other survivors, he was reluctant to come forward publicly. This reluctance was rooted in the social climate of the 1970s. Many gay men, especially those in high-profile positions or living closeted lives, feared the consequences of being outed in a police investigation. The San Francisco Police Department, despite having a prime suspect and multiple witnesses, found themselves hamstrung by this reality. One of the survivors was described as a well-known entertainer, another as a diplomat. Neither was willing to testify in court, fearing the publicity would destroy their careers and personal lives. The investigation yielded a promising suspect in 1976, a young man who matched the physical description and was known for his artistic abilities. He was questioned but never charged, partly due to the lack of willing witnesses and partly due to insufficient evidence. The suspect, whose name has never been publicly released, reportedly broke down during questioning and cried, but maintained his innocence. As the investigation continued into 1976, detectives found themselves facing a frustrating paradox. They had a suspect in custody who matched the description perfectly, not just physically, but also in terms of his background and artistic abilities. Yet without the cooperation of surviving victims, they couldn't move forward with prosecution. Inspector Rotea Guilford, one of the lead detectives on the case, later recalled the immense frustration of having what he believed to be the killer within grasp, only to watch him slip away due to circumstances beyond law enforcement's control. "We had the evidence," Guilford stated in a 1977 interview, "but we didn't have the testimony we needed to make it work in court." The suspect, who was attending art school at the time, had been brought to police attention through a tip from someone who recognized the composite sketch. When questioned, he exhibited knowledge of the crimes that hadn't been made public, but this alone wasn't enough to secure an indictment. Investigators noted his sketching style matched descriptions provided by witnesses who had seen the Doodler at work in various bars. During interrogation, the suspect's behavior raised numerous red flags. Detective Dave Toschi, who also worked on the infamous Zodiac case, noted that the young man's emotional breakdowns during questioning seemed performative rather than genuine. He would cry, then completely compose himself when we changed subjects, Toschi documented. It wasn't the behavior of someone truly overwhelmed by false accusations. The suspect's background revealed other troubling indicators. He had a history of psychiatric treatment, and former acquaintances described him as having difficulty maintaining romantic relationships. Several people who knew him from the Castro district's bar scene reported that he would often become confrontational when rejected by men he was interested in. One bartender, who worked at the Rendezvous, a popular Castro district establishment, later provided a statement describing an incident where the suspect became agitated after a patron refused to accept a portrait he had drawn. "He tore the sketch to pieces right there at the bar," the bartender recalled. "There was something in his eyes that made me uncomfortable enough to remember it months later." The investigation also uncovered that the suspect had taken classes in anatomy and had some medical knowledge, which aligned with the precise nature of some of the stab wounds found on the victims. The medical examiner had noted that several of the fatal wounds appeared to have been inflicted with an understanding of human anatomy, targeting vital organs with chilling accuracy. Meanwhile, the 3 surviving victims remained firm in their decision not to testify. The diplomat, whose identity remains protected to this day, was facing a particularly difficult situation. In the 1970s, being openly gay would not only have ended his career, but could have had serious international ramifications. The State Department's policy at the time was explicit. Homosexuality was grounds for immediate dismissal and revocation of security clearance. The entertainer, who investigators described as being nationally known, faced similar pressures. Despite private conversations with detectives where he provided detailed descriptions of his attack, he ultimately chose to prioritize protecting his career and personal life. His attorney made it clear that any attempt to compel his testimony would be met with legal resistance. The third survivor, who had managed to fight off his attacker near Golden Gate Park, was perhaps the most forthcoming with police, but still refused to testify in open court. He described in detail how the Doodler had approached him at the truck stop bar, drawn his portrait, and suggested they go somewhere more private to continue their conversation. The attack that followed was savage, and he only escaped by striking his assailant with a rock and running to a nearby occupied vehicle for help. This survivor's description of the attack pattern proved invaluable to investigators, as it matched evidence found at the murder scenes. He described how the Doodler's demeanor would change completely once they were alone, shifting from charming and artistic to cold and violent in an instant. This Jekyll and Hyde transformation was consistent with what other witnesses had observed in the suspect's general behavior. By late 1976, the case had reached a devastating impasse. Inspector Guilford and his team had what they believed to be strong circumstantial evidence: the suspect's physical match to descriptions, his artistic abilities, his knowledge of the crimes, his presence in the Castro district during the relevant time period, and his psychological profile. But without testimonial evidence from the survivors, prosecutors deemed the case too weak to bring to trial. The suspect was released but remained under surveillance for several months. Detectives noted that his behavior changed markedly after his interrogation. He stopped frequenting his usual haunts in the Castro district and appeared to withdraw from the art school community. Whether this change was due to guilt, fear of further police attention, or simply coincidence, remains a matter of speculation. The aftermath of the Doodler investigation had far-reaching implications for both law enforcement and the LGBTQ+ community in San Francisco. It highlighted the devastating impact of societal homophobia on criminal investigations, where the fear of being outed could outweigh even the desire to bring a serial killer to justice. This reality would continue to hamper investigations of crimes against LGBTQ+ individuals for years to come. The case also drew attention to the vulnerability of gay men in an era when their very existence was criminalized in many places. The Doodler's victims were targeted not just for their sexuality, but for the societal pressures that forced them to seek connection in shadowy bars and secluded meeting places. The killer exploited a system that had already made his victims vulnerable. As the 1970s drew to a close, the Doodler case began to fade from headlines, but its impact on San Francisco's gay community remained profound. The murders had exposed a devastating vulnerability: how the same societal prejudices that forced many gay men to live in secrecy also protected their killer. Inspector Guilford would later describe it as a perfect storm of social inequality and criminal opportunity. In 1977, a significant development occurred when investigators discovered a potential connection between the Doodler murders and several unsolved homicides in Southern California. 3 men had been found stabbed to death in Los Angeles County between 1973 and 1974, each last seen in gay bars, and each reportedly in the company of a young black man who had been drawing sketches. However, jurisdictional issues and lack of cooperation between departments meant these leads were never fully explored. One of these Los Angeles victims, Robert McCaffrey, had been found with a sketch in his pocket, a portrait drawn on a cocktail napkin. While the sketch was partially degraded, forensic artists noted similarities in style to descriptions of the Doodler's work. Unfortunately, the evidence was mishandled during transfer between departments and was subsequently lost, representing another missed opportunity in the investigation. The prime suspect's movements during this period became a subject of intense scrutiny. Police records show he had traveled to Los Angeles several times during the period of the Southern California murders, allegedly to visit art galleries and pursue potential animation work. However, without cooperative witnesses or solid physical evidence, these coincidences remained just that, coincidences. A former roommate of the suspect, speaking to investigators under condition of anonymity, provided troubling insights into his behavior during the murder period. He would disappear for hours at night, then come back and immediately start drawing, the roommate recalled. Sometimes he would fill entire sketchbooks in one sitting, always the same face over and over. When I asked him about it, he said he was practicing capturing souls on paper. The roommate also described finding blood-stained clothing in their shared bathroom on at least 2 occasions. When confronted, the suspect claimed he had gotten into fights at bars, but the roommate noted that he never showed any injuries himself. These incidents occurred close to the dates of 2 of the confirmed murders, but by the time this information reached investigators, the clothing had long since been disposed of. Another crucial piece of evidence emerged in 1978, when a former art instructor of the suspect came forward. The instructor had kept some of the suspect's work from his classes, including several sketches that showed a progression from realistic portraits to increasingly disturbing imagery. The faces in his later drawings became distorted, almost demonic, the instructor noted. It was as if he was no longer drawing people, but something darker, something that lived inside them. The instructor also remembered conversations where the suspect expressed frustration with his subjects, complaining that they never looked right, and that he needed to get closer to really see them. In light of the murders, these comments took on a much more sinister meaning, but again, they weren't enough to build a case that would stand up in court. The investigation was further complicated by the discovery of copycat incidents. Several men reported being approached by individuals claiming to be artists, clearly attempting to mimic the Doodler's method. While none of these encounters resulted in violence, they created confusion and made it harder for investigators to separate genuine leads from false ones. One particularly disturbing aspect of the case emerged through interviews with bartenders and regulars at the Castro district establishments. Multiple witnesses described seeing the suspect's artwork improve dramatically over time, suggesting that he may have been using his victims as unwitting practice subjects before killing them. Each portrait potentially represented not just a record of his victims, but a documentation of his developing skill, both as an artist and a killer. In 1979, Inspector Guilford made one final attempt to convince the surviving victims to testify. He arranged private meetings with each of them, presenting new evidence and emphasizing the likelihood of additional victims if the killer remained free. While all 3 survivors expressed remorse at their inability to help, they remained firm in their refusal to testify. The diplomat, in particular, provided a heartbreaking explanation. "You're asking me to choose between justice for the dead and protection for the living, my family, my children. I cannot sacrifice their lives to avenge others." The investigation's files contain dozens of sketches collected from bars throughout the Castro district during this period, each carefully preserved in hopes of finding a match to the killer's style. Many showed remarkable artistic talent, but without confirmed examples of the Doodler's work to compare them to, they provided no actionable leads. These sketches remain in evidence storage today, silent testimonies to the lives intersected by this investigation. By 1980, the active investigation had largely ground to a halt. The suspect had moved away from San Francisco, though police monitored his movements for several more years. He reportedly pursued a career in commercial art, though not specifically in animation as he had once aspired to. Investigators noted with grim irony that he had achieved his goal of making a living from his artwork, though not in the way he had originally planned. The 1980s brought new challenges to San Francisco's LGBTQ+ community with the emergence of the AIDS crisis, and the Doodler case, like many others, was overshadowed by this new threat. However, dedicated investigators continued to follow leads and monitor their prime suspect, even as active investigation resources were redirected to more current cases. In 1982, a retired police officer who had worked the original case made an interesting connection. He noticed that the locations of all 5 confirmed murder sites, when plotted on a map, formed a rough pentagonal shape around the city. This geometric pattern seemed too precise to be coincidental, suggesting the killer might have chosen his dump sites with deliberate forethought. This theory was supported by evidence that all victims had been killed elsewhere and transported to their final locations. A forensic psychologist consulting on the case in 1983 provided new insights into the killer's possible motivations. After reviewing case files, witness statements, and surviving victims' accounts, she theorized that the act of drawing his victims served multiple purposes. The sketching wasn't just a ruse to gain trust, she wrote in her report. It was a form of ownership, a way of capturing his victims before he killed them. The physical act of murder may have been, in his mind, a way of completing his artwork. This theory was supported by an interesting detail that had been overlooked in the original investigation. Several witnesses reported seeing the suspect return to bars where he had met his victims, sometimes days or weeks after the murders. He would sit in the same spot and sketch, but instead of approaching new potential victims, he would appear to be recreating scenes from his previous visits. One bartender described it as like he was trying to relive something. In 1984, investigators received an anonymous letter that appeared to be from someone who knew the suspect personally. The letter described how the suspect had maintained a hidden portfolio of sketches, which he referred to as his special collection. The writer claimed these sketches were different from his normal work, featuring portraits that appeared to be drawn post-mortem. Despite an extensive search, this portfolio was never located. The letter also revealed that the suspect had continued to create art with disturbing themes. He had reportedly attempted to sell a series of paintings to galleries in Los Angeles, featuring what he described as transformative portraits, images that showed faces morphing from life into death. While these paintings could have provided valuable evidence, they had all been sold to private collectors and were never traced. A significant breakthrough came in 1986 when one of the surviving victims, now terminally ill with AIDS, decided to provide a full, recorded testimony about his encounter with the Doodler. While he still refused to testify publicly, his detailed account provided valuable new information about the killer's methodology and psychology. The survivor described how the suspect had talked about his art being a way to see inside people, and had seemed particularly fixated on capturing his subject's eyes. He told me that eyes were the windows to the soul, the survivor recalled in his testimony. He said most people's eyes were lies, but in his drawings he could show their true nature. When he attacked me, the last thing I remember before fighting him off was him saying he needed to see my eyes change. This testimony added a new dimension to investigators' understanding of the killer's motivations, suggesting a deeply disturbed individual who viewed murder as a form of artistic expression. The survivor's testimony also revealed previously unknown details about the suspect's background. He had apparently spoken about growing up in a religious household where his artistic talents were discouraged, and about spending time in a juvenile facility where he first began seriously developing his drawing skills. While these details helped build a more complete psychological profile, they came too late to be actionable in any prosecution. In 1987, a former romantic partner of the suspect came forward with disturbing information about his behavior during their relationship in the late 1970s. She described finding sketchbooks filled with portraits that seemed to show the same faces in progressive states of decay. When questioned about these drawings, the suspect had claimed they were studies for a graphic novel about a vampire artist who captured his victims' souls through portraits. The sketchbooks had long since disappeared, but her description matched other accounts of the suspect's artwork. By 1988, cold case investigators had compiled enough psychological data to create what they believed to be the most complete profile of the Doodler to date. The profile suggested that, unlike many serial killers who keep trophies from their victims, the Doodler's sketches served as his mementos. Each drawing was theorized to represent not just a record of his victims, but a captured moment of power and control. The profile also highlighted the significance of the suspect's choice of weapon. Unlike other serial killers who used guns or strangulation, the Doodler preferred a knife, requiring close physical contact with his victims. This aligned with his need to see inside his victims, both metaphorically through his art and literally through his violent acts. In 1989, a breakthrough came when an art gallery owner in Portland, Oregon, contacted San Francisco police about a series of unusual portraits that had been submitted for a showing. The artist's style and subject matter bore striking similarities to descriptions of the Doodler's work. While the artist used a different name, investigators were able to trace the submissions back to their prime suspect. The portraits, described as studies in transformation, showed men's faces transitioning from peaceful to agonized expressions. Detective Carl Sanders, who examined the Portland paintings, noted in his report, "The level of detail in the expressions of pain and fear suggests someone who had witnessed these emotions firsthand. These weren't imagined, they were remembered." Unfortunately, by the time investigators reached Portland, the paintings had been sold to private collectors who chose to remain anonymous. A former neighbor of the suspect from the early 1980s came forward in 1990 with an account that seemed to confirm investigators' theories about his continued compulsions. She described hearing him pacing at night, and through their shared wall, the sound of furious sketching. Sometimes he would talk to himself while he drew, she reported. He would say things like, "Now I can see you clearly, and you can't hide anymore." In 1991, one of the original investigating officers, now retired, published a carefully worded article in a law enforcement journal about the case. Without naming the suspect, he detailed how the killer's artistic ability had served as both his signature and his shield. The article prompted a response from a psychiatric nurse who had treated the suspect in the late 1970s. While bound by patient confidentiality, she was able to confirm that he had exhibited what she termed artistic obsession with transformation through violence. As the case approached its 20th anniversary in 1994, cold case investigators attempted to use newly developed DNA testing on preserved evidence from the crime scenes. However, the technology of the time, combined with the age and condition of the samples, yielded no usable results. The physical evidence, like the witnesses who might have testified, had been eroded by time. The suspect, meanwhile, had built a quiet life away from San Francisco. Periodic checks by law enforcement found him working in commercial art, having apparently channeled his talents into legitimate pursuits. Yet those who followed the case couldn't help but notice that his professional work often featured themes of transformation and hidden identity, perhaps reflecting the duality that had once made him such a dangerous predator. The case of the Doodler remains one of San Francisco's most haunting unsolved crimes, not just for the brutality of the murders, but for what it revealed about society's treatment of the LGBTQ+ community. The killer's ability to escape justice due to his victim's fear of exposure stands as a stark reminder of how societal prejudice can enable predators by silencing their survivors. Today, the case files contain hundreds of sketches, witness statements, and psychological profiles, but still no justice for the victims. The true number of those killed may never be known, as many similar cases from that era remain unsolved. The Doodler's legacy lives on not only in the lives he took, but in the way his case helped expose the devastating intersection of prejudice and violence in American society. The story of the Doodler serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who can hide behind talent and charm, using society's own prejudices as their accomplice. While the case may remain officially unsolved, its lessons about the importance of creating a society where all victims can seek justice without fear of persecution continue to resonate today.